Everyone thinks they know how Cristiano Ronaldo's famous free kick works. You run up to the ball, you hit it ridiculously hard, and somehow it flies toward the goal almost perfectly straight, then suddenly drops, shifts sideways, or appears to change direction right before it reaches the net. It looks impossible, and most people assume Ronaldo is simply putting an insane amount of curve on the ball, like David Beckham. But here's the fascinating part. Ronaldo wasn't trying to maximize the curve. He was doing almost the opposite. High speed, minimal spin, extremely clean contact. That's the basic idea behind a knuckleball. And in this video, we're going to break down exactly what makes that shot so unpredictable. We'll look at Ronaldo's approach, his contact point, his ankle, his follow-through, the speed of the ball, and the aerodynamics happening after the football leaves his boot. Because once you understand what's happening in the air, you'll realize the secret isn't controlling the ball more. It's making the ball harder to predict. Let's start with the biggest myth. A traditional curling free kick works because of spin. When a player strikes the ball off-center and wraps their foot around it, the football begins rotating rapidly. That rotation interacts with the airflow around the ball and creates an aerodynamic force known as the Magnus effect. That force pushes the ball sideways. So you get the classic free kick. The ball starts outside the target, bends around the wall, and curls into the corner. It's beautiful, but it's also relatively predictable. The ball is spinning, and the aerodynamic force has a consistent direction. So although the goalkeeper has to react quickly, the flight itself follows a recognizable curve. A knuckleball is different. Instead of deliberately giving the ball lots of side spin, the player tries to launch it with very little rotation. And that completely changes the way the air interacts with the football. As the ball travels through the air, the airflow separates from its surface. The seams, panels, and surface of the football affect that airflow. When the ball is spinning rapidly, those effects are averaged out by the rotation. But when the ball barely spins, tiny changes in the airflow can have a much bigger influence. The pressure around the ball can change. The aerodynamic forces can shift. And the trajectory can suddenly move. The ball might dip, then shift sideways, then wobble again. It isn't magic. The football isn't actually changing its mind. The airflow around it is changing. And that's what makes the knuckleball so dangerous. You're deliberately creating a less predictable flight. Think about a spinning football. When the ball is rotating rapidly, that rotation helps organize its aerodynamic behavior. Put side spin on it, and the resulting force can consistently push the ball in one direction. But reduce the spin dramatically, and you remove much of that predictable behavior. Now the airflow becomes far more sensitive to tiny changes. And when the football is moving extremely quickly, even a small aerodynamic change can matter. That's why the ball doesn't need to move 5 meters sideways to beat a goalkeeper. A relatively small movement at exactly the right moment can be enough. Because the goalkeeper isn't trying to catch the ball after it has already moved. They're trying to predict where it will be. And that prediction is exactly what the knuckleball attacks. Now, let's look at how Ronaldo actually creates it. It starts with the approach. That famous Ronaldo run-up wasn't just for aesthetics. The approach helps generate the speed and body mechanics needed for a powerful strike. He approaches the ball aggressively, plants his standing foot, and drives through the football. But here's the important part. The goal isn't simply to kick the ball as hard as possible. You need high velocity, but you also need to control the spin. Because if you strike too much across the ball, you create rotation. And once you introduce significant spin, you start moving away from a knuckleball and toward a conventional curve shot. So the run-up creates the conditions for power. But the real magic happens in a fraction of a second. Contact. Where and how the boot hits the football matters enormously. For a knuckleball-style strike, the objective is to create a huge amount of forward velocity without giving the ball excessive rotational motion. Think about the difference between pushing straight through a ball and cutting across it. Cut across it, you create rotation. Drive through it, you create forward movement. That's the basic idea. The contact needs to be direct and clean, transferring as much energy as possible into the football while minimizing unwanted spin. And that's much harder than it sounds. Because even a tiny difference in contact can change the ball's rotation. Change the rotation, and you change the aerodynamics. Change the aerodynamics, and you can completely change the shot. Then there's the ankle. When you're trying to curl a football, your foot naturally moves across the ball. That helps generate spin. But for a knuckleball, that wrapping motion is exactly what you're trying to avoid. The striking foot needs to stay firm through impact. Not because your entire leg should become stiff, but because you want a stable surface transferring energy directly into the football. Imagine hitting a tennis ball. If the racket moves straight through the center, most of the energy sends the ball forward. If the racket cuts across it, you introduce more rotation. The same basic principle applies here. So don't think, freeze my leg. Think, drive through the ball without wrapping around it. And that brings us to another common misconception, the follow-through. You've probably heard that you need to stop your leg immediately after striking a knuckleball. Not really. The most important thing happens during contact. The ball receives its energy in an incredibly short collision. What matters is whether your striking motion creates unnecessary rotation. If you deliberately sweep across the football, you'll probably add spin. If your movement stays more direct, you have a better chance of keeping the rotation low. So the goal isn't to magically stop your leg. It's to avoid cutting across the ball. Now we get to the part everyone remembers. The sudden dip. You've seen it. The ball appears to be heading toward one area of the goal, and then suddenly drops. The goalkeeper looks perfectly positioned, until the ball falls away from the expected trajectory. So, what's happening? The football is traveling through constantly changing airflow. With very little spin, the airflow around the ball can separate unevenly. That changes the pressure distribution around its surface. Those pressure differences create aerodynamic forces. And because the football is traveling at high speed, even relatively small changes in those forces can alter its trajectory before the goalkeeper has time to react. That's why the ball doesn't need to move dramatically. It might only move a little. But if that movement happens at the exact moment the goalkeeper commits to a dive, it's enough. And that's why goalkeepers hate the shot. Goalkeepers aren't simply reacting to where the ball is. They're predicting where it's going. They read the striker's approach, the standing foot, the hips, the kicking leg, the initial trajectory. All of those clues help them make a decision. Against a normal curling free kick, the ball generally follows a smoother path. But with a knuckleball, the initial trajectory can look completely normal until the ball suddenly moves. And by then, the goalkeeper may already have committed. That's the real weapon. The knuckleball attacks prediction. Now here's another myth. You don't create a knuckleball simply by smashing the ball as hard as possible. Power matters. A faster ball gives the goalkeeper less reaction time. But raw power alone doesn't create the effect. You can hit a football incredibly hard and still produce an ordinary shot. The real combination is simple. High speed, low spin, controlled contact. That's the sweet spot. Too much spin? You get a more predictable curve. Too little speed? The shot loses much of its threat. But combine high velocity with very little rotation, and you create the conditions for that unpredictable movement. And that's why Ronaldo's technique was so difficult to copy. People watched him score those ridiculous free kicks and thought, just hit the ball harder. But that's only one piece of the puzzle. The approach, body position, contact, ankle stability, ball speed, and spin all have to work together. And even then, there's no guarantee. That's because the entire technique depends on creating an unstable flight. A tiny difference in contact can make the ball curve instead. A slightly different amount of spin can reduce the movement. A poor strike can send the ball completely off target. So there isn't one magic trick. It's a combination of mechanics and aerodynamics. And that brings us to the biggest mistake people make when trying to copy Ronaldo. They want the knuckleball movement, while also adding a little bit of curve for control. But that's exactly what can ruin it. Because significant spin makes the ball's aerodynamic behavior more predictable. So instead of thinking, how do I curve this ball? Think, how do I send it extremely fast while keeping unnecessary rotation as low as possible? That's the fundamental difference. The approach creates momentum. The standing foot positions the body. The leg accelerates. The ankle provides a firm striking surface. The foot drives through the ball. The football leaves the boot with high velocity and very little spin. And then, the air takes over. The result can be a ball that dips, shifts, or wobbles just enough to destroy the goalkeeper's prediction. And that's what makes the knuckleball so fascinating. You're not trying to control every centimeter of the ball's flight. You're creating the conditions that make the flight difficult to predict. A traditional free kick says, "I'm going to control the curve." The knuckleball says, "I'm going to give the ball speed and minimal spin, and let the aerodynamics create the problem." So the next time you watch one of Ronaldo's famous free kicks, don't just watch where the ball ends up. Watch the contact. Watch the rotation. Watch the first few meters of flight. And then watch what happens as it approaches the goal. Because the secret isn't that Ronaldo somehow made a football perform impossible tricks. He mastered a technique that combined high speed, low spin, and unstable aerodynamics to create one of football's most unpredictable shots. The ball doesn't need to move wildly. It just needs to move at exactly the wrong moment. Because sometimes the most dangerous shot isn't the one you control perfectly. It's the one you make impossible to predict. If you want more football myths broken down using the actual science behind the game, subscribe and comment the next football myth you want busted. Because there's a ridiculous amount of physics hiding inside the world's simplest looking game.